Some stories never make national headlines, but stories from small towns and coastal communities deserve recognition too. I'm Kylie Lowe, host of Dark Down East, a true crime podcast that gives voice to victims through investigative journalism and powerful storytelling. Set in my home state of Maine and the greater New England area, it's my goal to dig through the archives to bring the stories of the people at the heart of these cases to light. Listen to Dark Down East wherever you get your podcasts.
Insurance may all seem the same on the surface, but having insurance isn't the same as having State Farm. It's like getting a granola bar with a candle in it when you wanted a 3-layer birthday cake. You wouldn't settle for just any dessert on your birthday, so don't settle for just any insurance. When it comes to getting the help you need, State Farm is the real deal. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Last week, you heard the prosecution's story. A house locked from the inside, 2 people murdered, and every circumstance pointing towards a bitter daughter. Lizzie Borden had the motive: years of resentment toward her stepmother, Abby, and fear she'd lose her inheritance. She had the opportunity, too, as the only one home that morning. So there she was, on trial for murder, facing the incriminating evidence: a hatchet found in the cellar, the dress she burned days later, and the story of a note police say never existed. But in the courtroom, there are always 2 stories, and the defense painted a very different picture. They said the Commonwealth's version was built for headlines, not for truth. That investigators, desperate to solve a gruesome crime, built their case on shaky ground. No eyewitnesses, no confession, no proven weapon, just theory, speculation, and suspicion. And suspicion, they reminded the jury, is not enough to send a woman to the gallows. As the defense took the floor, they opened a door the prosecution had tried desperately to keep shut. And with it came a question that still echoes more than a century later. Was Lizzie ever really alone in that house? This is 13 Juror Podcast, where we break down real court cases and put you in the juror's seat. 2 sides, the same evidence. You decide what to believe. I'm your host, Brandy Churchwell. Today's episode is Massachusetts versus Lizzie Borden, Part 2, The Defense. The defense began by asking a simple question. What if the state was wrong? From the start, the defense made it clear this wasn't a story about guilt. It was a story about blindness. How investigators were so certain they'd found their killer, they stopped looking for anyone else. They told the jury the prosecution's case was built on assumptions, and their so-called evidence was a house of cards, circumstantial, inconsistent, and, most of all, incomplete. When defense attorney Andrew Jennings rose to deliver opening statements, he told the jury a story. In a distant land, when a murder occurs and no one knows who committed it, they measure the distance to the nearest person. And if that person can't prove their innocence or identify the real killer, they're executed. In that country he spoke of, someone must be punished, guilty or not. Despite the story sounding extreme, his point was unmistakable. Lizzie Borden wasn't on trial because the state had proven her guilt, but because she was the closest one to the crime. Jennings went on to outline what he called the 4 classes of facts that the prosecution relied on: the motive, the conduct and appearance of the accused, the weapon, and most importantly, exclusive opportunity. Each one, he promised, would collapse under scrutiny. And piece by piece, he planned to dismantle them, showing why his client, Lizzie Borden, could not have committed these murders. But the defense wasn't just there to tear down the Commonwealth's version of events. They were there to build another, one that led jurors outside the locked doors of the Borden house. They promised to show that the police ignored witnesses who said they heard noises near the Borden yard the night before, brushed aside the unlocked side door, and omitted the fact that the barn was left open. And that while investigators swore no stranger could have slipped inside, evidence suggests that one already had. The defense was about to turn the prosecution's story inside out. According to the testimony and evidence they presented, this is the defense's version of the story. The defense argued that the weakest link in the state's chain was motive. To them, the idea that Lizzie Borden had any reason to kill her father and stepmother simply didn't hold up. Attorney Andrew Jennings reminded the jury Lizzie Borden wasn't some resentful daughter plotting revenge. She was a woman known for her devotion to her father, her church, and her community. Her sister Emma testified to that herself. She told jurors that Lizzie had a great respect and affection for their father, and that she had never seen so much as a harsh word exchanged between them. Witnesses described Lizzie crying openly at her father's funeral, her shoulders shaking as she wept over his coffin. One even recalled that she placed his wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry he ever wore, on his finger before he was buried. Hardly the behavior of a woman consumed by hatred or greed. As for her relationship with her stepmother, Abby Borden, the prosecution had painted a picture of years of resentment. But the witnesses closest to the Borden home told a very different story. Emma, the Borden's other daughter, testified that she had never seen Lizzie and Abby exchange unkind words. There were no arguments between them in the days before the murders, none that she ever heard of. Family friend Marianne Holmes said she'd seen Lizzie and Abby attend church together, sitting side by side, leaving together, perfectly cordial. Even Alice Russell, one of the prosecution's own witnesses, admitted she had never once seen Lizzie and her stepmother argue. She couldn't recall Lizzie ever saying or doing anything violent or threatening in her presence. As the defense brought new witnesses to the stand, the prosecution's motive argument quickly unraveled. Even the story about the so-called property dispute didn't hold up. Emma testified that after their father deeded property to Abby's family, he also gave property to the sisters to make things even, and that after that, there were no more issues. And what about the remark Lizzie previously made to an officer, where he says she told him, "She is not my mother, sir. My mother is dead." The prosecution used it as proof of contempt, but the defense said it was nothing more than a statement of truth from a woman in shock, speaking to an officer who, by that point, seemed intent on finding fault in her every word. Jennings pointed out that another witness referred to her own stepmother in the same way from the stand. No one accused her of hatred. And even Mrs. Gifford, the woman prosecutors said Lizzie once told she hated Abby, took the stand and flatly denied ever hearing those words. Even Bridget Sullivan, the family's housekeeper, told the jury she never heard a single harsh word pass between Lizzie and Mrs. Borden. They were civil. Sure, they kept different schedules, often having breakfast at different times, but for good reason. The sisters slept late, and the Bordens rose early. That's not avoidance. It's life in a household of adults with different routines. Jennings told the jury that the state had tried to manufacture resentment where none existed, twisting family distance into hatred and ordinary habits into evidence. When he finished, he left the jury with one final reminder. Motive may build a story, he said, but it cannot build proof. If there was no true reason or evidence of animosity, the question wasn't why Lizzie would do it, but if she even could. And with that, the defense shifted to who the woman at the center of this case really was. One whose entire life stood in direct contradiction to the crime she was accused of. Lizzie Borden lived what anyone in Fall River would have called a spotless life. She was known for her honorability, kindness, and generosity. She was raised in the church, active in charitable work, and devoted to her community, even serving on a board at the local hospital that was dedicated to helping others. She was, by every account, the picture of an upstanding Christian woman. Jennings told the jury that this was not the portrait of a cold-blooded killer. It was one of a woman whose reputation had been built over decades on faith and compassion. To drive this point home, the defense brought in witnesses to tell the story of who Lizzie really was. Mrs. Holmes, a lifelong family friend, had known Lizzie since childhood and attended the same church for years. Holmes described Lizzie as gentle, dutiful, and considerate. Echoing this characterization was Lizzie's older sister, Emma, who told the jury that Lizzie had always been kind, generous, and deeply devoted to both her family and her faith. She also spoke about Lizzie's quiet nature within the home. To Jennings, this testimony wasn't just about character, but credibility. Could a woman who had never done anything wrong suddenly and without warning erupt in an act of unspeakable violence? Defense attorney George Robinson reminded the jury that the human experience teaches us that if a daughter grows up in one of our homes, is educated in our schools, and devoted to her church and community, it is not possible that she suddenly becomes a vicious murderer. Lizzie's own actions that day spoke volumes. She hadn't tried to flee. She called for help immediately. She urged the police to search everything, to look anywhere they wished. Open it all up, she told them. Find out everything you can. There was no hesitation or fear of discovery. And when investigators tried to turn suspicion toward others, Lizzie was the first to defend them. She told police that Bridget Sullivan, the Irish maid who'd worked for them for nearly 3 years, was innocent. She even corrected officers who suspected their farmhand that he wouldn't do such a thing. If Lizzie were truly guilty, Jennings asked, why defend others instead of deflecting blame? He told the jury it defied logic and human nature. They also said it was a ridiculous proposition that Lizzie, after supposedly murdering her stepmother in cold blood, would calmly remain in that same house for an hour, waiting for her father to return so she could kill him too. And as for those who claimed she was cold or emotionless, the defense said that too was unfair. Mrs. Churchill testified that there was clearly something wrong with Lizzie. She was distraught and pale, leaning against the doorframe. Bridget said she'd never seen Lizzie so agitated. And though she later claimed she didn't see Lizzie cry, the court reporter confirmed that Bridget had originally testified that Lizzie was crying. This was the portrait of a woman in shock who had just stumbled upon the brutal murders of her father and stepmother. And as jurors looked at the quiet, neatly dressed woman seated before them, the defense asked them to consider whether she looked like someone capable of the crimes the state described. Unfortunately, though, reputation alone couldn't free her. Because even though the defense had painted a picture of a woman incapable of violence, the Commonwealth painted something else entirely. A woman armed with opportunity and a weapon. That weapon, a broken-handled hatchet, was paraded around the courtroom by the prosecution like a smoking gun. But it was about to lose its edge. In a double homicide that left both victims brutally struck with a hatchet-like object, the state's theory depended on one critical piece of evidence: a handleless hatchet found in the Borden cellar. But the defense said there was one fatal flaw in that theory. There was no way to prove it was the murder weapon. Dr. William Dolan, the medical examiner who oversaw the investigation, took the stand. He admitted under oath that no blood was ever conclusively found on that hatchet. Neither were any fingerprints, tissue, or physical evidence of any kind that could link it to the murders, or to Lizzie Borden. Even more damning, Dolan agreed with the defense that the handleless hatchet could not be definitively linked to either killing. It simply fit the theory, not the facts. And then, a revelation that cast doubt on the state's entire case. That handleless hatchet hadn't even been the original weapon of choice. Early in the investigation, police had seized 4 potential weapons, 2 axes and 2 hatchets, all of which they initially believed could be the murder weapon. One of them, a claw-headed hatchet, drew particular attention. Dr. Dolan claimed he could see the impression of its claw in Andrew Borden's skull. But then, that hatchet quietly disappeared from the case. It was only after Professor Edward Wood, a forensic expert for the defense, examined all of the weapons that the story began to unravel. Wood testified that he found no blood, tissue, or human hair on any of them. The only thing recovered? Animal hair from a cow. He told the jury that if any of those hatchets had been used in the murders, it would have been impossible to clean them so thoroughly in such a short amount of time. After that, the claw-headed hatchet was never mentioned again. The state shifted its focus, now insisting it must have been the handleless one. The defense told the jury that the officer who found that handleless hatchet, Officer Fleet, initially threw it back into the box where he found it, dismissing it as irrelevant. It sat ignored for weeks. until suddenly they needed a new answer to the question of the weapon. The broken-handled hatchet had other problems too. The prosecution claimed it was rusted from washing off blood, but the defense countered that it came from something far more ordinary: time and salt. It had been tossed into an old salt box in the cellar, and Andrew Borden, he reminded the jury, was notoriously frugal. He never threw anything away, not even broken tools. It was far more likely that Andrew discarded the hatchet there long before the murders, and since no one could say when the handle had actually been broken, the state couldn't prove otherwise. Besides, Jennings told jurors, the idea that this old, dull blade had caused the precise, clean wounds found on the victims was absurd. Professor Edward Wood agreed. He testified that he had boiled the hatchet in a solution of chemicals, a test sensitive enough to detect even the faintest trace of blood, and found none. The defense accused the prosecution of forcing the evidence to fit their story, instead of letting the evidence tell the story itself. Last summer, it was the claw-headed hatchet. Then it was the handleless hatchet. The wounds are 3.5 inches. No, 4.5 inches. The story shifts, the weapon changes, but the proof is never there. And if the prosecution couldn't even identify the weapon used to commit the crime, how could they prove who wielded it? Jurors were reminded that circumstantial evidence requires interpretation. It is often opinion disguised as certainty. And when opinion replaces fact, innocent people can hang for crimes they didn't commit. So when they were done with the weapon argument, they moved on to the other circumstantial evidence the prosecution said pointed to Lizzie.
Insurance may all seem the same on the surface, but having insurance isn't the same as having State Farm. It's like getting a granola bar with a candle in it when you wanted a 3-layer birthday cake. You wouldn't settle for just any dessert on your birthday, so don't settle for just any insurance. When it comes to getting the help you need, State Farm is the real deal. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Halloween's almost here, and with Target Circle 360, you can get everything you need delivered to your door right when you need it. Out of their favorite candy? Ordered. Need snacks for a party? Done. Looking for a backup costume because your kid changed their mind? Handled. With Target Circle 360, Halloween fun is covered. Join now and get same-day delivery all season long. Only at Target. Membership required. Subject to terms and conditions. Applies to orders over $35.
The Commonwealth presented a trail of damning clues: a burned dress, a missing note, and even talk of poison. But the defense told the jury that once they looked past the headlines, every one of those clues would crumble, starting with the story that Lizzie burned a bloody dress. The state called it destruction of evidence. The defense called it nonsense, and had the witnesses lined up to prove it. The family's dressmaker and Lizzie's sister Emma both testified that they had seen paint on the dress and even described it in the same spots: across the front, along the hem, and on the ruffle at the bottom. And the stains weren't new. They'd been there weeks before the murders. The person who painted the Borden home even recalled Lizzie leaning near the buckets of paint while choosing the correct shade for the house. Aside from the paint, the dress was made from a very cheap material, causing the color to fade after washing. Even more compelling, according to the defense, the dress was hanging right in the closet, completely accessible for the police to take had they seen anything suspicious on it. The police searches, according to Emma, were very thorough. Mr. Dolan, who was overseeing the investigation, told her it was as thorough a search could be made unless the paper was torn from the walls and the carpets taken from the floor. They searched for an entire afternoon and only took one dress. Every box and bag was examined, even a trunk in the attic. Lizzie never objected. Mariana Holmes confirmed that Lizzie invited her into her room and also allowed the police to search without objection, remaining calm and composed during the search. Emma testified it wasn't until days after the police search that she noticed the stained dress. She had gone to hang one of her own dresses in the closet and asked Lizzie, "Why don't you just destroy that old dress? It's soiled and useless." So she did. Lizzie burned the dress, with the kitchen doors and windows wide open. It was in broad daylight, and there were officers all over the yard. The defense asked, "Does that sound like A guilty woman destroying evidence? To top it off, according to Emma, the dress Lizzie burned wasn't even the one she wore the morning of the murders. Then came the state's story about poison. Prosecutors hinted that Lizzie tried to buy prussic acid, a deadly toxin, and that maybe the whole family's strange illness in the days before the murders was part of her plan. To the defense, all that was a rumor. And Dr. William Wood testified that there wasn't a single trace of poison found in Mr. or Mrs. Borden. And finally, the note. From the start, police had seized on Lizzie's story that her stepmother had received a letter that morning calling her to visit a sick friend. When no such note was ever found, they said she'd made it up. But the defense offered another explanation. Bridget had mentioned the note to Mrs. Churchill that morning, suggesting she did know about it. Alice Russell later said the note may have simply been thrown in the fire, as most mail was once it's read. And as for why no friend ever came forward, Jennings said that wasn't mysterious at all. Maybe they didn't want to be dragged into a murder case. Maybe they didn't even know the note had become evidence. Or, chillingly, maybe the note had been part of the killer's plan to lure Mrs. Borden upstairs and out of sight. Each piece of the state's evidence, the defense said, collapsed the moment it was tested. No blood, no poison, no note. Only assumptions stacked one on top of another until the whole structure came tumbling down. For weeks, the state had painted Lizzie as the only person who could have done it. But what came next would shatter that illusion and change the entire tone of the trial. Testimony from neighbors, strange noises in the night, and the haunting suggestion that the real killer may have been closer than anyone imagined. To the Commonwealth, the simplest part of this case was opportunity. The house was locked, the murders happened in daylight, and Lizzie Borden was the only one home. But the defense called that a dangerous assumption, because the opportunity cuts both ways. They told the jury that the timeline the state presented didn't just leave room for doubt. It left no room for Lizzie at all. From Bridget's chores to Uncle John's visit to the breakfast table, and the moment Andrew Borden walked through that front door. Every minute of Lizzie's morning could be accounted for, and none of it fit the prosecution's story. If Lizzie Borden truly had the exclusive opportunity to kill, then the evidence, witnesses, and clock had all conspired to say otherwise. The defense began by rewinding the clock, not to the morning of the murders, but to the night before. It was late, close to 11 p.m., when the quiet of 2nd Street was shattered by something strange. One of the Borden's neighbors, Martha Chagnon, told the jury she'd been awake in her sitting room when she heard loud, heavy pounding coming from the direction of the Borden fence. It was so forceful, she said, she could hear it from the opposite side of her house. Her stepmother heard it too. She paused, listening. The noise came in bursts. Several sharp strikes, then silence. Martha almost got up to look, but convinced herself it was just someone working late in the barn. She went to bed. Around that same time, Mr. Gifford, another neighbor, was walking home and saw a stranger wearing a straw hat sitting motionless in the dark on the steps outside the Borden home. Gifford stopped, uneasy. This man didn't belong there. When Gifford tried to wake him, the stranger's hat slipped off, and Gifford realized he didn't recognize him at all. Moments later, another passerby, Mr. Kirby, encountered the man in the same spot. A loud noise, a stranger on the property, and the next morning, 2 people dead. To the defense, that wasn't a coincidence. It was a clue. Maybe Lizzie wasn't the only one with opportunity. Maybe someone else, someone the state never looked at, had been there all along. And as the defense led jurors through the next morning's timeline, they said the prosecution's version wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. The gaps, the timing, the uncertainties, all of it, they said, opened a door, literally. The prosecution wanted the jury to see the Borden home as a fortress, a house sealed tight to the outside world. But the defense witnesses told a different story. They said those locks weren't barriers, they were habits, quirks of a cautious family in an old creaking home. And more importantly, they weren't all locked that morning. And if those doors weren't locked, then neither was the state's theory. Let's start with the front door. The defense acknowledged that Lizzie had bolted it Wednesday night. That wasn't in dispute. But by Thursday morning, they argued, she had unbolted it, leaving only the spring latch in place. That latch, a relative testified, could be opened with just a little pressure if the bolt was undone. In other words, the door the prosecution said was locked to the world might not have been locked at all. And the back door, the one with the screen, raised even more questions. The state leaned heavily on the idea that it was hooked from the inside, but Bridget testified it wasn't always latched, especially on mornings when she was washing windows. She admitted on the stand that she'd left it unhooked that morning when she went in and out of the house, sometimes to the barn for water, sometimes chatting with the Kellys' maid over the fence, sometimes while she was washing the outside of the windows for Mrs. Borden. The defense told the jury that with a distracted maid and an unlatched door, anyone could have slipped inside unnoticed. Door by door, the defense dismantled the image of a fortress. The Borden home was a house full of entrances, exits, and opportunities. So then the question becomes, who was stepping through these doors?
Hi there, my name is Annie Elise, aka your true crime BFF and host of the podcast Serialously. I have been a true crime enthusiast forever, but I wished somebody would break down the cases for me like a friend, giving all the details and discussing every twist and turn. So I decided to create a podcast that does just that. I do the deep dives in these cases so you don't have to, diving into all the raw details, saying what we're all thinking, and in a conversational way. So join me and let's talk all things true crime. Serialously with Annie Elise. New episodes drop every Monday and Thursday wherever you get your podcasts.
The essential carrot puree, made with organic carrots, a bit of green apple, and a touch of ginger. Served still slightly warm and fed, mostly, to 7-month-old Harper and her 3-year-old doodle named Arthur, who helped clean up any remainder. The essential first bite, made possible by Vitamix. Only the essential.
Delia Manley and Sarah Hart told the court they'd seen a pale man in light-colored clothing standing by the Borden gate around 9:45 a.m. He was watching them closely, but turned away when they met his gaze. 10 minutes later, when they left, he was still there. Dr. Benjamin Handy, walking past the Borden house around 10:30, also saw the pale, nervous man pacing near the property. He said he'd seen him 2 days before, too, always lingering nearby. Then came Mr. Chase, who saw a man in a brown hat and black coat sitting in a carriage outside the Borden home around 11, right around the time Andrew Borden was killed. No one recognized him and no one ever identified him. And perhaps most disturbing of all, a woodsman named Joseph LeMay testified about 2 weeks after the murders, while cutting poles near the edge of town, he came across a man sitting on a rock, muttering, "Poor Mrs. Borden," over and over. When LeMay called out to him, the man picked up a hatchet and shook it toward him before running off into the woods. But not before LeMay noticed blood on the man's shirt. To the defense, these were warnings the prosecution had ignored. If strangers, who may have had both opportunity and motive, were near the Borden property that day, maybe Lizzie didn't commit the murders. Mary DeFree testified that she saw a man on the steps talking to Mr. Borden months earlier. He was angry. She heard him accuse Mr. Borden of cheating him, and he vowed to get revenge. Lizzie had confided in Alice that she was worried that some of the angry men her father dealt with would try to do something to him. Could that be what happened? And could someone have entered unseen? The defense said yes, easily. Here's their alternate theory. The assassin could have slipped through the unlatched screen door while Bridget was washing windows or fetching water from the barn. He could have crept through the kitchen, up the front stairs, the stairs that led straight to the guest room where Abby Borden was found. And once inside, he waited. Maybe he studied the Borden's home and learned the family's habits, like when Andrew usually left for his morning errands or when Bridget went outside and when the house would be quiet. If Andrew was the target, it's possible Abby caught him off guard. Maybe he sees her and, out of fear of being caught or recognized, he acts. She walks into the guest room to make the bed, busy and unaware. It's the perfect time to strike. A quiet step behind her, then 19 blows. Savage, brutal, efficient. Lizzie hears a noise. She'd later tell Bridget about it, wondering if it could have been the sound of Mrs. Borden coming home. But for now, she just continues her daily routine. The stranger then could have slipped back into the stillness of the narrow house, waiting for his true target, Andrew Borden. Downstairs, Bridget continues with her chores. Outside, witnesses see the pale man in light clothing, pacing, watching, waiting. One neighbor said he turned away nervously when she looked at him. Another said he stood there long after she'd gone, leaning on the fence as if waiting for a signal. The defense suggests this man could be more than just a passerby. He could be the lookout man. The defense paints the scene like a clock winding toward violence. Andrew Borden returns home just after 10:40. Bridget lets him inside, then goes upstairs to rest. Lizzie stepped out to the barn. For the first time that morning, Mr. Borden is alone. The killer moves. He comes into the sitting room where Andrew has settled on the sofa. No warning, no sound. 10 blows to the face and head, an attack so brutal, he's left unrecognizable. Then, silence again. The killer slips out the same way he came in, leaving the door open in his rush, just like Lizzie found it when she returned from the barn. Outside, more witnesses see a man in dark clothes, a black jacket, a brown hat, pacing near the property. He's wearing heavy clothing on one of the hottest days of the year. Could this be an attempt to conceal the blood? And then the murderer vanishes into the heat of that August morning, taking the weapon with him, leaving behind no evidence, no footprints, and no trace of who he was. This theory wasn't just speculation. The defense carefully tied it to the evidence piece by piece. The unlatched back door confirmed by Bridget's own testimony. The multiple witnesses who saw men loitering near the property before and after the murders. The medical examiner's admission that the times of death could have been much closer together than the prosecution claimed, meaning the killer could have struck both victims minutes apart, not hours. They went on to debunk ways that the prosecution claimed it could have been done. The dress Lizzie burned couldn't have fit under her other dresses because of how it was made. And the police did exhaustive searches where they didn't find a single piece of Lizzie's clothing that was stained with blood. Lizzie's hair and her hands were completely free of blood, too. Dr. Cheever told the jury it is almost impossible to get blood out of hair except by special treatment. How is it possible to commit a murder, completely clean yourself up, commit another, and again become spotless in just a matter of minutes, and do it without leaving a trace of blood anywhere? The defense argued it's not. During their search, investigators couldn't find a weapon that could be tied to Lizzie or the murders. And Lizzie herself sent Bridget down to the cellar to show the police where they kept the hatchets and tools. It would be preposterous for her to send police to the spot where she hid a murder weapon. What's more likely is that the killer took it with him. Even the ice cream peddler's testimony supported Lizzie's story. He saw Lizzie in the barn just after 11, walking slowly toward the house in a dark dress, not the lighter-colored one that she burned days later. Officer Medley testified that he didn't believe Lizzie had been in the barn that morning because he claimed he saw no footprints in the dust upstairs. But that claim quickly fell apart. At least half a dozen witnesses admitted they had gone up into the loft before Medley ever arrived. Reporters, officers, even curious townspeople, all walking through the very space he said was undisturbed. By the time Medley inspected it, the dust and any footprints were likely long gone. The timeline and the evidence led the defense to one chilling conclusion. If the doors to the house were open, someone else besides Lizzie could have been there. Attorney George Robinson told jurors that it's not up to them to critique the theory he presented, but it is up to them to critique the one the Commonwealth did. They didn't have to believe Lizzie was innocent, only that she might be. Robinson rose slowly from his seat to deliver closing arguments. This was it, his final chance to pull every thread of doubt together to save Lizzie Borden's life. Weeks of testimony, hundreds of pages of evidence, and a woman's future, all balanced on the words he was about to speak. He first walked the jury back through every weakness in the state's case: the missing motive, the vanished weapon, the impossible timeline. These acts are morally and physically impossible for this defendant. Then he turned to something more emotional: the way Lizzie had been treated. He reminded the jury that Officers Fleet and Mullally, two of the state's key witnesses, couldn't even agree on their own recollections. Their stories contradicted each other so often, Robinson said, that neither could be trusted. But it wasn't just their inconsistency that troubled him, it was their conduct. They had stormed into a home where a daughter had just discovered her father's body and treated her not with sympathy, but with suspicion. They interrogated her like a criminal before the blood on her father's face had even dried. Robinson faced the jurors and asked a question that went beyond law and into conscience. What would you do if a man, even an officer, came into your home and spoke to your wife or daughter that way? It was an appeal to conscience, an emotional strike that reframed Lizzie not as a killer under suspicion, but as a woman under siege. Robinson called the Commonwealth's theory a fraud, born under duress during a time of disaster. He compared it to a witch hunt and reminded the jury, we do not burn witches anymore in Massachusetts. He explained that all it takes to acquit Lizzie is reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt, he explains, is any doubt for which you can give a reason. He pleaded, she is in your charge. Do not walk her to her death. It would be a mistake that is irreparable. A mistake you'll think about for the rest of your lives. The fate of Lizzie Borden was finally in the jury's hands, and at 3:24 in the afternoon, they retired to deliberate. Just over an hour later, at 4:32 p.m., they filed back into the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict. The clerk instructed Lizzie to stand, then turned to the jury and asked, "Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?" The foreman answered, "We have." He handed the folded slip of paper to the officer, who passed it to the clerk. The clerk began to read. Lizzie Andrew Borden, hold up your right hand. He instructed the foreman to look upon the prisoner and the prisoner to look upon the foreman. He asked, "What say you, Mr. Foreman?" The foreman cuts him off. Not guilty. A gasp, then an eruption. Applause bursts from the gallery, echoing through the large courtroom. Lizzie collapses into her seat, puts her head in her hands, and lets out a cry of joy. Her sister Emma rushes to her side as the attorneys and spectators crowd around, offering congratulations. She tells Emma, "Now take me home. I want to go to the old place and go at once tonight." Lizzie Borden walked out of the courtroom a free woman. Her trial became a national sensation, one of the first in American history to be covered by the Associated Press. For the first time, news of courtroom drama traveled coast to coast. The story had everything: money, mystery, and a woman accused of an unthinkable crime. Major newspapers from Boston to New York filled their front pages with every twist. One reporter said, "There has never been a trial so full of surprises." When the verdict came, the headlines praised the jury and condemned the police. But outside the courthouse, the town of Fall River was divided. To some, Lizzie was the wrongfully accused daughter of a respected man. To others, she was a murderer who had simply escaped justice. Even now, historians point to key rulings from the three-judge panel as the reason she walked free. The judges had excluded two of the prosecution's strongest weapons: statements Lizzie had made, which were riddled with contradictions, and the claim she tried to buy poison the day before the murder. The court ruled her inquest statements inadmissible because she'd been under arrest, questioned without counsel, and her words were not voluntary. And when prosecutors tried to introduce the poison evidence, the judges barred that too. After the trial, Lizzie and Emma inherited their father's fortune, worth millions by today's standards. Lizzie bought a mansion in Fall River's most elite neighborhood, The Hill, but her life never went back to normal. The scandal of the trial resulted in the community isolating Lizzie. Her church no longer welcomed her. Children rang her doorbell at night and began taunting her with a nursery rhyme that is still repeated today. Her home became a target, constantly pelted with gravel and eggs. Even though she'd been acquitted, she was never truly free. Emma lived with Lizzie for more than a decade, but the two had a falling out in 1904 and severed ties. Emma moved out the following year. Lizzie lived in the mansion until she died at the age of 67 in 1927. Emma died just 9 days later. They are buried side by side next to their mother and Andrew and Abby. It took just 1 hour for 12 jurors to reach a verdict, one that divided a town, launched a legend, and left behind one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime. Historians, journalists, and generations of true crime followers have tried to piece together what really happened that morning. But the truth, whatever it is, will forever remain locked in that house on 2nd Street. Today, Lizzie Borden's life is a ghost story wrapped in lace, whispered in a nursery rhyme. The jury set her free, and yet, more than a century later, the world is still deliberating.
The essential avocado and banana smoothie, made with ripe avocado, frozen bananas, organic almond milk, and a generous spoonful of your favorite protein powder. Fueling busy mornings, countless workouts, and the occasional Zoom meeting that should have been an email. The essential energy boost, made possible by Vitamix. Only the essential.
Nothing brings us together like Eggland's best eggs. Always so fresh and delicious, plus superior nutrition like 6 times more vitamin D, 10 times more vitamin E, and 25% less saturated fat compared to ordinary eggs. For us, it's eggs any style, as long as they're the best. Eggland's Best. Better taste, better nutrition, better eggs. Visit egglandsbest.com to learn more.